Well, and welcome to the second event of the Sloane Lab Research Seminars. It is a great pleasure to have you today with us, and it is a great pleasure to have Cora and Nina with us today, that they're gonna give us some excellent presentations in the area of digital humanities. We will start with some, housekeeping introductions. We all know our ways around these live events and how to deal with Zoom, but please make sure that you know your ways around and how to make questions. At the very bottom of your screen, we do have the questions and answering button that you can use to raise any questions that you have. Also, you can raise your hand. Initially, we're going to go through the presentations, and then we're going to go into the Q&A questions. Now, some information about the code of conduct. The symposium offers us a space to think and explore together. Speakers and attendees both contribute to making this space and the symposium a success. We value and encourage all points of view expressed to build constructive dialogue. In this spirit, questions should be asked through the Q&A function with respect and generosity in a way that promotes this dialogue and not shuts it down. In the highly unusual circumstance that questions are asked in a way that is disruptive, offensive, aggressive, or otherwise unacceptable, we will take appropriate steps, which may include asking the questioner to leave the seminar. We are hopeful that this not be required. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the very first speaker of our seminar. Today with us is Koraljka or Kora Golub, who is a professor in the Institute of Linnaeus University and also a co-leader of the LNU Digital Humanities Initiative and program coordinator for MA in Digital Humanities. Cora has a long-term experience in working in the area in the field of digital humanities. Her core research interests are in the field of information retrieval, with focus on knowledge organization and also integrating knowledge organization systems with social tagging and automated subject indexing and evaluation of information retrieval. Today, Cora is going to present us a very important and interesting paper with the title Subject Access in Online Information Services for Humanities, the Case of LGBTQI Fiction. Cora, the floor is yours. We are welcoming you to our seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. How is this for sharing the screen? Looks fine. Thank you so much, Andres, and everybody in the team for inviting me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And I also look forward to some discussions on how we could perhaps do some joint action to change the rather sad status of subject access in online information services for humanities in general. So the title of this talk is also about an LGBTQI fiction project that we have been awarded funding for within Sweden. And it was actually funded as an infrastructure for supporting humanistic research within the Digital Humanities call. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I think now we have a window of opportunity that we could seize in order to change sort of the problem that has been with us since the advance of the internet from the 1990s and hasn't been solved today, which is really bad subject access, especially for humanities resources in online services. I've divided the talk into three main sections. just briefly look at subject searching today, the promise and reality. Then we'll focus a bit more on the LGBTQI fiction. But also the third section, I think, is really, really important for any online information retrieval system, because although we have metadata and controlled vocabularies in many libraries, in particular, some museums and archives as well, those related to subjects, they're not really being used at the level of the interface, and users don't have sort of any benefit of them in many cases. And just the fourth section will be a very brief wrap up. So, subject searching today, from promise to reality. On one hand, we still keep hearing things. Everything we need is just click away. Simply by talking, you can get information from Siri, or Siri can even read your mind. Siri does more than ever, even before you ask. Or there are actually research projects like the ones by where you look at an image, and the more you look at the image, the longer you look at it, the more similar the resources will retrieve to that image. So you don't have to click or type, but simply do it by gazing. However, these are still experimental. The reality for most people, not just in the humanities, but in particular in the arts and humanities, is that we often get search results that are either too few, too many, or too fuzzy. For example, a colleague of mine recently looked for TikTok and youth cultures, and she went to the Swedish Union catalog, meaning the largest number of libraries in Sweden, and she got 0 results. And this is in spite of the fact that libraries that do take part in this Union catalog have metadata, but they have not been mapped to what the user query may be to offer alternatives like broader term or accepted terms in the system and so forth. On the other hand, if you go to a search engine like Google, you will get 14 million results for the same query. And this does not mean that you haven't missed any important results, even if you're able to go through all of them. And the questions then ask, well, how do you know you have found everything you need in services like that? Another big example is on the right part of the screen. OneSearch is a discovery service that most university libraries in the Western world have, which brings together search interfaces or databases of everything that the library has access to. So the library catalog, but any databases of journal articles, ebooks, and so forth. And if we write, for example, the term Macedonia, which can mean a lot of different things, it can be the Republic of North Macedonia. It can also be a region of Greece. It can be an ancient kingdom. It can be some cities in the United States that have that name. But what we get as a result is 70,000 results or further facets which are completely meaningless and feel very random. Science and technology, 7,000 results. Macedonia, 4,000 results, but it does not tell us what is meant by this Macedonia. And this is, again, in spite of the fact that we have the metadata in the databases that are being cross-searched here. So what we know is that online subject searching is quite common, but rather challenging compared to knowing the author and title. And this is because users may be formulating search queries with insufficient knowledge of the subject matter or insufficient knowledge of information searching. Technically, it's most challenging because of the semantic ambiguities inherent to natural language, like polysemy, homonymy, and synonymy, meaning that words can take on different meanings and different concepts can be represented by different words. And this is why in systems like bibliographic databases of journal articles, of libraries in particular, we have been using something known as controlled vocabularies and assigned indexing, using terms from these controlled vocabularies who address the problems of natural language. Controlled vocabularies examples are subject heading system, information retrieval thesauri, classification systems, who are aimed to help the user select a more specific concept. For example, in Macedonia, it would be really useful to actually help decide what is meant by Macedonia, what kind of specific aspect, as well as to disambiguate it. Or a broader concept, like we saw in the TikTok example. Hierarchical browsing of some of these systems also allows users to learn about the different concept spaces, what the information system covers, and allows them to formulate their queries more accurately as a result. And indeed, some of these functionalities have been implemented in commercial services that don't necessarily use controlled vocabularies in the sense that we have been using them in libraries and other bibliographic services. But if you write Jaguar in Google, it will first retrieve results about the car. And if you scroll a bit down or to the right of the main search results, you will also be pointed to Jaguar as the animal, which likely resorts to Google's knowledge graph and goes to DBpedia for disambiguation. Or eBay. If you are looking for a guitar, eBay helps you define it further because it's very hard to see through over 800,000 results. So it tells you, well, do you mean electric guitar, acoustic guitar, used guitar, so forth. But it also gives you a nice hierarchical overview with all the places where guitars are mentioned, not just under guitars to get more specific terms, but also art or books and so forth, because that's actually what you may be looking for after all. But discovery services or systems like OneSearch, where we show the example of Macedonia, don't really make use of the metadata that are in the databases that they cross-search on. Instead, there are no mappings between those metadata. The results are overwhelming in numbers. We have seen the facets that are supposed to help us are confusing. So research has shown that these discovery services that are rather expensive for university libraries actually only work for known item searching, whereas people then go to other places to do subject searching. Just to wrap up this first section with Scopus, that claims to provide the broadest, most integrated coverage of peer-reviewed literature, including social sciences and arts and humanities. But if we look a bit deeper, they, on the other hand, claim to assign manually index terms for 80% of the titles, including the Scopus, but zero control vocabularies of them are for the arts and humanities. Instead, they focus on engineering, medical sciences, geology, and so forth. And research has shown that it's really hard to actually find something in a good way, in a systematic way, and know that you have found what you were looking for and that you have exhausted all the resources that you wanted to find. So this was first part in general about some problems. I'm happy to talk more about other types of humanistic databases. But let's now look at searching for LGBTQI fiction as an example that would also give us more ideas of what can go wrong and what can be done to make it right. Essentially, my experience from this is based on a queer-lit project funded within Sweden. As I mentioned earlier, it was part of an infrastructure and call for proposals, in which we are now building a dedicated database with an advanced search interface and a thesaurus simply to support finding Swedish LGBTQI fiction, both for the researcher, because that was the target of building this infrastructure, but also, of course, we'll make it open for the general public. Just to go one step back and think about fiction indexing, that's been problematic in many places for many, many years because due to limited resources or general traditional practices, fiction indexing has been limited to genre, and facets of time and place. So where the author is from, when a book was written, and which genre it is. But people are actually looking for plot and other characteristics like pacing, storyline, frame, tone, and so forth. So without talking about LGBTQI fiction, fictionism per se is problematic to start with, which is why a lot of libraries are actually importing complementary metadata from social tagging services like Library Thing. For example, Pride and Prejudice in Library Thing also goes beyond facets of time, space, place, and genre. It also tells us that it is about women, Victorian women, sisters, love, marriage, family, and so forth. And this does really better address the needs of the users. Now, when it comes to LGBTQI fiction indexing, here we write Swedish, but essentially similar problems have been identified in any general subject heading system, which are now changing and they're improving. But essentially, when we started the project, the problem was that the LGBTQI terms from SAO, which is a Swedish subject heading system, similar to Library of Congress subject headings, are lacking in specificity. There are very few of them to start with, and often, for a while, up until recently, you would just describe a work with LGBTQI, period. You would not make a difference between L, G, B, and so forth. Also, if we look at older works, which is, again, not typical of Sweden only, but everywhere, these works have not been assigned any subject heading. So if you would come to Libris, the Swedish Union catalog, and search for LGBTQI works, this very first Swedish novel about being transgender, written by a transgender author in 1983, would not be found because it has 0 subject headings. It has just 2 classification marks, and both of them just tell us that this is a fiction. So how did we approach this project? Well, we wanted to be interoperable, and we didn't want to create things from scratch. So we adopted the Homosaurus more international thesaurus available in English, among others, and we translated it to Swedish, keeping the terms that were relevant for our project. And we also enriched it with terms that were specific to the Swedish context, like the Swedish legislation, but also what we have learned from our potential end users in various ways of collecting those data. So most of the terms still have exact or close matches to Homosaurus, and we have kept this connection in the database in order to ensure future interoperability. This slide shows how the term bisexuals is represented in Swedish subject headings, SAO on the left, and in the queer lit thesaurus, or QLit as we call it, on the right. Here we see that the biggest difference is that we have many more narrower and related terms. And also that we have a scope node. We have decided to have a scope node for each term, both to ensure indexing consistency, but also to help users learn about the different terms when they come to the database. This slide shows then an example of how the Queerly project describes the same novel with many more terms or concepts that have been shown also as needed. So covering actual themes rather than just saying that it's an LGBTQI work. We then mention, for example, breast censorship, dating websites, police harassments, and many others. We have really tried to involve end users in the project through having regular advisory board meetings. Also through Pride festivals around Sweden, we have been holding workshops and trying to get feedback from users. And we have conducted 2 web-based questionnaires, one of end users and one of librarians. When it comes to the 2 web-based questionnaires, we have learned that main reasons for people not being able to find LGBTQI fiction wherever they are looking for, and they're most often looking for them in social media, to a smaller degree in library catalogs. They report that there are too few books that are on the theme, but they don't have the right index term. So one participant wrote, books with LGBTQI themes that I know of don't get retrieved. Unless the main theme is obvious from title or review, it won't be classified as LGBTQI, and so forth. Or the indexing is too shallow, as we have also seen from the examples and discussed earlier. Subtler themes or supporting characters are not indexed. And there aren't so many of those books, so it's really good to go deep and wide when it comes to representing themes and exhaustivity and specificity of indexing. Also, as mentioned before, the users also found that LGBTQI index terms from, for example, Swedish subject headings were too general, and there were also no more unusual subjects or rarer subjects like poly, asexual, or intersex, and so forth. These are not particularly surprising, but it was good to learn about that. What we assumed would be the case is the case, and we have also collected a lot of other information on how to build the interface. And we have asked, among others, what kind of search functionalities people would appreciate, like what we have seen with Google's disambiguation of Jaguar, or with eBay's disambiguation of guitar. The users said that they would like both more possibilities to find broader or related search terms, for example, if they get too few results, but also they would also like to get more narrower results, to get more specific books if they retrieve too many. If they're all LGBTQI, it would be nice for them to be able to see the difference as natural. They would also like to be able to browse by hierarchically arranged subjects to get an overview of what the collection has, if they're not looking for anything particular, or if they are wanting to find out about what the collection has, and also word sense disambiguation. Now, how did we translate this to search functionalities? I'll just spend another few minutes talking about that. And before I go there, I would like to say that search functionalities are essentially lacking from a lot of different interfaces in libraries, archives, and museums, especially the ones that should build on metadata from controlled vocabularies. Some examples of what they should provide is browsing by subject access points, like hierarchical, browsing by individual concepts from controlled vocabularies, for searching by these terms. Some also point to the need for being able to differentiate between major and minor themes represented by controlled vocabularies, especially if you have so many subjects as we do in QueerLit. Suggesting authorized controlled versions of entered search terms, so we don't get 0 results, like in the TikTok example, as well as linking subject access points from one controlled vocabulary to others in order to ensure interoperability in larger databases like discovery systems. And here are just a couple of slides on how we have tried to address some of them in the QueerLit database. So here's the link, queerlit.dh.gu.se. It is available and open. It's still being developed, though. It is a research like interface. We haven't had time to do full usability studies. And if you can help with that, please do let me know about that. But anyway, here we see the beginning of the alphabetical list, which is also a bit hierarchical. Here, if we write the term bisexual, it will automatically translate this into control terms that have that term, like mothers to bisexuals, young bisexuals, and so forth. Also, if you write a term that is not used by as an index term, like tjej, which is slang for girl in Swedish, it's automatically translated into flickor, or girls in Swedish. And if we look at the metadata record for flickor, then we see here that there is a variant tjej or tjejer, which allows users to find these terms. I've also mentioned already that we use scope notes to secure indexing consistency and help users learn about what is meant by the different terms. We have also decided to make a difference between major and minor themes because we want it to be really exhaustive in indexing LGBTQI fiction in this project. Also, we have created information about the mappings to other controlled vocabularies like Swedish subject headings for children, Homo saurus, LCSH, and general Swedish subject headings. In short, and coming towards the end, we have talked about the problems of subject searching, how controlled vocabularies have been there for a while, but haven't been teased out at the level of interface in many, many different places, while at the same time, commercial services like Google and eBay are seeing the advantage and are trying to implement the functionalities that we have potentially, but don't make use of. However, it's also good to remember that controlled vocabularies are not ideal. There can be problems with them. They can be slow to update, especially if they are large and used around the world. They could be hard to change those major structures like large classification systems. They can have bias. So we could also consider complementary approaches like social tagging, as it is being done in many libraries who complement their fiction indexing with library thing, imported clouds. Certainly, it's important to consider also automated methods as complementary approaches. But in all, my main point was that I think that we should collaborate more. And even though digital humanities are already very interdisciplinary, even though knowledge organization as a field wants to be interdisciplinary and has been for a while, but it somehow seems that other fields like information retrieval, human-computer interaction, information behavior are still not well integrated. So taking DH even further, making them even more disciplinary, is something I think we need in order to fully understand the needs of the researchers, the general public, but also to jointly try to address this big problem that has been there for decades now, since the beginnings of the internet. And I wonder if you have some ideas how we could seize the opportunity now that we have funding windows within digital humanities, and how we can collaborate perhaps with IFLA for libraries, ICOM for museums, and ICA for archives. With this, I thank you very much for your attention. Be super happy to answer any questions and hear any suggestions. Some of the references are given in the end, and with that, I finish my talk.
Laura, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. You have, in such a short period of time, you have reached and addressed so many difficult issues that have been troubling us for years almost. And I think you have made a great breakthrough by, making this interoperable approach. I have heard about Homo saurus before, but it's the very first time that I see it being used and implemented in another language. I would encourage people to put their questions on the Q&A. We would come to the questions and answers sessions later on because now we're gonna move to the second presentation. But Cora, thank you very much to such an interesting presentation. I have many questions I would like to make, but let's keep our pace for now and let's come to the second presentation. So Alexandra, if you would like to take the floor, and we will come back to you. Thank you.
Gladly. Oh, thank you so much, Cora. Well, I have the delight of introducing Inna Kizhner, who's a research fellow at the Digital Humanities Lab at Haifa University in Israel. And her expertise is in investigating cultural bias in museum collections and studying the distribution of collection records to find out about gaps and skews in data, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is very important because it contributes to the understanding of the sources of data for reproducible research in the humanities. Inna's past and current projects look at how data in large collections are organized and aggregated, what effects are obtained as a result of such aggregation, and how they reflect social and cultural conditions of the periods when these records and collections were created. Her PhD was in cultural studies and digital cultural heritage, and she has an MA in digital heritage. So she's very well prepared to talk about the topic today, which is entitled Exploring Epistemic Bias in Museum Collections. Inna, over to you. Inna, you're muted.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be in the circle that I've been looking forward to meeting, and many of your papers I've been following for several years, including your papers, Cora, and many of the attendees and conveners. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen and we'll start my presentation. Right. So first, a little bit about motivation. Collections as data has been around us for many years now, and we all understand their value. With so many records, so many wonderful images, so much information around, we all look forward to really getting grip of collections as data and finding patterns. Indeed, with 700,000 works in the Rijksmuseum collection and wonderful high quality images, applying computer vision to extract fragments and make images machine readable and machine actionable, something we've also been looking forward to for several years, so that we can involve images in the scope of digital humanities. And all the wonderful records here where we can not only see basic metadata on temporal and geographical distribution, but also subject and, what is very important, documentation and contexts. We all understand that museum collections are a high and perhaps untapped reserve of rich data. And large-scale analysis of data is indeed something that appeals to us very much. And case-based studies, with all their fascination. Yesterday, I was at the conference produced by Humanities Research, and it was indeed fascinating how close reading and case studies make us understand things in depth through imagination and rhetoric. But larger samples and stratification of evidence certainly leads us to better generalizations. What we may also want here is reproducible research. We do want to return to collections and to repeat the empirical research that was produced before us, to make sure how and whether the patterns that are observed are not just the effects of the local approaches, but are indeed generalizable. So, do institutional collections and large data scale analysis enable reproducible research? Is it indeed true? as if we look deeper, we see that researchers in the humanities prefer personal corpora, lab data sets, and project data sets. For example, for Digital Humanities 2022 proceedings, just 6 conference papers out of 50 long papers mentioned libraries, archives, and museums as sources of data. Researchers prefer personal corpora. Researchers prefer project data sets. I don't have real evidence behind these statements. Unlike Kora's solid methodology, I haven't asked around. But still, the hypotheses that I can make are that it is about inconsistency in indexing, and Kora's wonderful presentation is an example of that. A lack of data formats. When people come to libraries and museums, especially to libraries, they want to find machine actionable data formats, and they cannot find them. And there is a lot of work in this direction, including transcribers. Also, gaps in metadata values, and Kora also mentioned that. Some fields are empty. Among the attendees of this conference is the lead researcher for the paper on Edinburgh University library books, where data were absent for 70% of locations for books in the collection. These results agree with our results for the Russian State Catalog of Museum Collections, where we also observe a lot of gaps in data. And definitely libraries, museums, and archives data sets are not representative or balanced enough. We observe a lot of cultural bias. What may be also important that museum collections or library collections do not include works for the canon that researchers may want or need. In the next parts of my presentation, I will address cultural bias as one of the reasons for the problems and issues, mostly of epistemic, but also of an ontological nature. How we know what we do not know. What are the reasons that we do not know? So cultural bias, in our understanding, is a sampling bias that is related to unequal representation of cultures. But how do we know that some cultures have low representation while other cultures are overrepresented? A simplified approach, but one of the only approaches, rare approaches that are available at our disposal, is to count the occurrences of records that relate to specific geographic locations. For example, if we go to the educational resource of the Metropolitan Museum, we can see that Europe is, out of 8,000 objects, Europe is represented by almost 4,000 objects, while Central and North Asia is represented by 75 objects. Of course, you can say, well, it's all about museum policies. Why are you trying to convince us that it is something that is inaccurate? It's just what the museum collected during the periods of its history. It's a national museum. It's a museum in the United States, so it may emphasize European and American culture. But if we look at the mission of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we can see that it presents significant works of art across time and cultures. So users may expect a more balanced distribution of records from cultures, temporalities, and geographic locations. There is a lot of progress in understanding cultural bias. Of course, we understand and know that cultural data is a mirror that reflects different periods in the infrastructures of knowledge making. And we heard a lot we felt pleased to explicate the circumstances of creating physical and digital collections. Among those are certainly pleased by Alexandra, also present among the conveners. So the pleas are to be very careful, to be very attentive towards who funds digitization projects, what selection criteria are applied, and how and why metadata schema are used. We also see a lot of subjectivity in data collections results that may be caused by the traditions of the periods when physical collections were formed. But we also see unexpected combinations of data sets that bring really unanticipated things. For example, if we search for Kazakhstan in Google Arts and Culture collection, we receive photos of aeronauts from the Soviet Union and the United States. It happens because Kazakhstan preferred not to provide any data to Google Arts and Culture, while the National Aerospace Agency provided 160,000 records. So the effect of aggregating almost zero data with a lot of data resulted in the substitution of two concepts. Instead of Kazakhstan culture, we get images of space stations in Kazakhstan that were frequented by Soviet, definitely because it was a Soviet space station, and American aeronauts. So there are layers of bias for the collections of cultural content. There are physical collections with their political and economic constraints and collectors' preferences. There are metadata for physical collections that were produced at various periods of time with various layers of bias. There are exhibitions published in physical catalogs that relied on research agenda of the time and on the academic traditions of the time. And later on, texts from these exhibitions move on to museum websites. There are digitized objects, and what gets digitized and what is not digitized is also related to political and technical constraints. And there are published collections with curators' subjectivity, social constraints, and the availability of skilled staff. Some geographic areas and geographic locations can afford skilled staff that tags collections in an appropriate way, including all the issues with indexing inconsistency, looking for synonyms and homonyms. Other collections do not have an opportunity and skills to do that. So how can we assess cultural bias? One of the methods is comparing collections-based data against baseline data. Of course, the most difficult point here is how to find baseline data. And this is the problem that doesn't only refer to cultural collections, but also to the collections in natural sciences. So what we wanted to know was how representative are influential aggregators of cultural content, such as Google Arts and Culture. If you Google Leonardo, for example, you get images from Google Arts and Culture. Whatever influential you Google, you get images of very high quality, wonderful images with wonderful metadata, well, of different quality, in fact, from Google Arts and Culture. So how representative is this aggregator? When we looked at the geographical distribution of records in Google Arts and Culture, we found that the top 5 countries provide almost over 90% of the content. Of course, it is connected with the fact that there are skewed collections within the top 5 countries, but still we can see how dominant are the countries that that have the most transparent data cultures, that can afford providing high quality images with good records, with good metadata. But even when we look at the records within Google Arts and Culture that relate to many countries, but are provided by Western cultural institutions or just other cultural institutions, those that mention a country in metadata, we still see huge inequality. These are combined effects of selection bias in physical collections, such as, for example, Egyptian collections in the British Museum, because there are countries which you just cannot reach. You cannot even in colonial times, you could not bring items from those collections to Western collections. So this is one layer of the bias, plus technological limitations of collections that still submit data. It means the geographical distribution of the content is defined by upper and middle income countries, and they contribute most of its content. But you may say, well, these countries that do not provide enough content, this content just doesn't exist. They don't have any culture, they don't have any museums, they don't have digitized data. Why do you think they should be there? To this end, we compared what we have in Google Arts and Culture to what we have in the Russian catalog of museum collections. Russian catalog of museum collections is a huge data set with almost 30 million records now and about 20 million records in 2019 when this project was carried out. So we looked at the geographical distribution in Google Arts and Culture, and we looked at the baseline, the Russian museum collections. You can see that although Google Arts and Culture presents museums from the central part of the country, that is around Moscow and St. Petersburg, the collections from the Russian catalog demonstrate a much more even distribution. We wanted to see whether these effects hold for other countries. So we looked at France, how France is represented on Google Arts and Culture, and how France is represented in the inventory of the Ministry of Culture in France. You can see a similar effect, that is, Google Arts and Culture shows the images from central museums, from the central part of the country around Paris, while museums in the inventory of the Ministry of Culture are more evenly distributed. So we can see that the geographical distribution in large aggregators and large collectors indeed produces a huge cultural bias that results in all sorts of inequalities and skews in data. But there might be other skews in data that are related to cataloging and annotating results. For example, this Armenian church is of the 4th century AD, but the date for the photo in the State Russian Historical Museum is 1958.
Have we lost Ina?
Yes.
I think we might have.
Let's let's wait for a minute or so. Maybe she would come back. I was so interested to hear, what was happening here in terms of cataloging process. Such an interesting presentation in terms of the biases. I wonder whether language is basically one of, the elephant in the room, how much English is actually influencing these biases. But let's see.
I have a suspicion Nina might be coming to talk about that at some point.
Yes, indeed. And then also, is how much, discrepancies between the collection sizes and how much is coming from the Western world. Though it would be nice to know how much of those collections actually contain, cultures beyond the Western world. And she was mentioning something about it, about the British Museum and the Egyptian collection. So all that was very, very interesting, and it's quite sad that we've lost connection now. This is the wonders of technology at the end of the day. Now we're at 20 minutes to 2, so we do have time. And I would encourage the participants to bring their questions to the Q&A. So I think what we could do now, even that Ina might be in a situation, she will try to recover her connection. And if everyone is all right, let's carry on with the question and answers with our discussion. And if we see that Ina is joining us in a little while, we can just interrupt. I think there's no other way that we can deal now with it other than waiting in silence and in vain, perhaps. So, okay, thanks everyone for joining once more. These are brilliant presentations. I think, are there any questions? Several questions have been already answered and addressed in the chat, as I can see. I don't know if there is any immediate question at this point, but I would like to start this discussion by making a very first question, or kind of one of those wonders as I was following Kora's presentation. I think, Kora, you've very nicely highlighted two main issues here. How slow is the response on controlled vocabularies to take, new terms and adapt, and the velocity in which domains develop nowadays, given that we are all producers of formation, we all enjoy access to, this digital environment, so knowledge production. Oh, hello, Ina.
Hello, so sorry.
Okay, I will pause here then my question. Kora, I'm going to come back. Perhaps you have already sensed what I was about to ask, but we will come to my question in a little while. Ina, it's very good to have you back. I was trying to, to cover a bit of the gap here, but excellent. So if you would like to carry on, that would be great. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, and so sorry for the loss. Right. So is it Armenian architecture? Is it an ethnographic field trip, an archaeological field trip from Russia to Armenia, with a little bit of colonial nuisances around that? There are no names of the Armenian people around him, of course, Alexandra. So there was something similar to what you do here. Or is it resilience to earthquakes of Armenian buildings? Because the head of the research trip also authored a book on how resilient are medieval buildings to earthquakes. So boundary objects intervene in using collections as data. Which perspective are we going to introduce? which perspective is the most important, which perspective is the least important. These are all questions without answers, but still they're very important. Right. In another project, we looked at Jews as a minority and looked at how this concept changes across space. We looked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which shows Jews in the context of ancient civilizations. And we looked at the Russian collection, at the Russian catalog of museum collections, which shows Jews as a Yiddish community within Russia. We looked at the distribution of records for a few search terms that related to Jewishness. You may think that Jewish is such a straightforward term. What can be deemed Jewish? It turns out that Jewishness is very different for different countries. For the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it's a lot of countries, including Mesopotamia and Roman civilization. For the Russian catalog of museum collections, it's just Russia and a few neighboring countries here. This is partly related to the fact that the Metropolitan Museum provides contexts, provides references and exhibition titles. For example, if a Mesopotamian seal is exhibited or was exhibited in the Jewish Museum, it will be tagged as Jewish. And this enlarges the context hugely, while the Russian catalog doesn't do this. But even if we look at the same data set, it may be subjective in choosing, the museum may be subjective in choosing objects for different representations. In a still different project, we looked at how 3 data sets from the Metropolitan Museum of Arts demonstrate the same records. For online digital museum collection, the data set is more or less geographically balanced, including countries in Europe, countries, certainly the United States, and countries in Southeast Asia. While when we access data via an API key, we can see that the Egyptian part of the collection suddenly produces a huge skew. It may be related to a project. We can only hypothesize what are the reasons. But for people who come to use an API key without the previous knowledge of how skewed the data set is, it may be very problematic to produce really reliable results. A recent seminar by Andrea Coxis demonstrated this very well. We may get reproducible results, but are they reliable? So we have plenty of ontological gaps in cultural heritage collections. So how can we see the general picture? When and how and whether we will be able to assemble, to reassemble the elephant, as Florian Windhager very smartly said. So now we publish large data sets of the most frequent objects of the most visible collections. And the consequences for that might be that we're going to see unified cultures, where cultural variety is reduced to what algorithms will see and what algorithms will reproduce. So plenty of outstanding questions for that. Objects with multiple meanings and how they can be transformed. Do museum records reflect our actual knowledge of cultural history? Do political, economic, and social circumstances introduce biases for different locations and different time periods? Which canons, which layers of canons are represented in digitized cultural content in metadata and records? And what periods, regions, and types of objects should be targeted, or whether they should be targeted to counterbalance that. These are all very difficult questions, difficult to address. The questions are also asked when we look at natural science collections. In Meinecke and Daru, people ask the same questions. So this is an exciting field, and our research demonstrates how interesting it is. So, and we all look forward to more interesting opportunities for research and questions ahead. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank all those who contributed to our research, including my supervisor, my colleagues from Siberian Federal University, colleagues from Bar-Ilan University, and Haifa University. Thank you.
Ina, thank you so much. And thanks for your perseverance and persistency here in delivering this talk despite the technical problems that we encountered during this time. But thank you so much for all that and for the very interesting presentation. So we will come now to the Q&A session. We do have 10 minutes. I'm not quite sure whether there are any questions that people would like to bring into our attention using the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand. Alternatively, I started by raising a question to Cora about the velocity in which we develop knowledge nowadays and how domains are developed, given then the different languages or the different type of concepts that we develop to characterize meaning and characterize content at the end of the day, and how slowly some of those controlled vocabularies adapt to these new domains or to new vocabulary. So with your experience using the Homosaurus into a new language and creating and enriching these results, how you find actually what is the method actually for bridging this gap between the slow response of controlled vocabularies and what's going on in the real world at the end of the day?
Thank you, Andreas. I think it actually really depends on the thesaurus size and the owners, because in our project, we were lucky enough to have subject experts running thesaurus for, at the same time, information professionals. So they knew cataloging, they knew how to enrich the thesaurus, and they were super open to getting more input. We've been it feels like we've been like crazy collecting input from users, be it researchers, general public, or people via social media. We're also providing input, and we are planning to have a forum on the database interface and ask people, okay, what else could we do? Which terms were missing? Also using log analysis to see which terms they used. So it works for us, but it is a small controlled vocabulary. It's 1,000 terms, and people are really motivated to work within it and have received funding. So that's very different sort of foundation for making it work compared to some other contexts.
And larger vocabularies. That they take more time basically to receive and ingest all this input that's coming from users, and the velocity in which all these domains develop. Brilliant, thank you. Do you have any plans to feed back to the Homosaurus? Is there any plans that this resource can become multilingual, perhaps?
We are in touch with them, not me myself perhaps as much, but colleagues who are developing the thesaurus in particular are members of their team in some way, and I think it's a really lovely community altogether on all the sides, which is why this works. We were thinking of translating thesaurus into other Nordic languages, or at least Scandinavian ones, and to act as some kind of center to help other Scandinavian countries with that. And then also we are maintaining backwards compatibility by keeping the mappings to homotheros. So it shouldn't be a problem to do a multilingual search at all once the system allows us to support that kind of querying as well. We are part of the Swedish Union Catalog software. So some of the solutions will have to wait until they have decided to implement them so that we can do it. We could do some things that they didn't have, but not everything. We have the plans though.
Yeah, no, that is an excellent plan looking forward. I think it's a very much important domain to be developed, given the content that is created in this direction and how much we have lacked behind in addressing some of those issues. So thank you, Cora. Thank you so much for all your contributions. Alessandra, I'm not quite sure if you would like to take the floor. And
yeah, I've seen actually Marco's put a fantastic question in here, so I think we should maybe jump straight to this one. Marco has asked, Inna, if possible, could you please expand on the reasons why we get different results when querying APIs? Given the emphasis on APIs in the collections as data discourse, this seems to be a pressing issue.
Right, that's why we started this research in the first place. Well, there are, again, I can only hypothesize. I haven't asked people at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This might be probably connected with different projects. The online database is one part of the museum, while API dataset, the key to API dataset is the responsibility of different people related to different projects. But this is really very exciting, and it gives evidence and supports the plea to explicate principles behind digitized collections and digitized datasets. We do not know what is going on behind the scenes. We trust the museum. It is the authority. And when we see what we really have, it is very different from what we assume. That's why explication is so important. I'm not sure I answered your question, but this is the only answer I can produce.
And it's such an important kind of call to arms for that sense of clarity and transparency that we need when we're talking about collections as data and what's coming from the institutions. While you're speaking, while you were out of the room, we had briefly touched upon kind of the importance of language and how maybe languages and different kind of linguistic traditions may be factored into some of the results that you were seeing in the research. I didn't know if you could maybe add something on the language dimension, because obviously that then certainly links to, I think, what Cora is doing a lot as well.
Right, I noticed the link, of course. I just didn't know whether I could comment on that, considering the time limits. Well, I do not think it's a matter of linguistic issues, because we just translated the term. Our research was not as solid as Cora's. We just took 7 basic terms and translated them from English into Russian. But Jew doesn't have any, well, it has, doesn't have any equivalence apart from that. These terms match quite equally. And we included a few, probably 1 or 2 derogative terms in Russian apart from what we had in pejoratives to what we had in English. But they didn't produce a lot of results that could skew the picture. Probably a score, 2 scores more, no more than that. I think it's rather the issue of historical developments and the issue of academic traditions, and the issue of contextualizing, because if you are deeply inserted in the academic traditions that place an ethnic minority in one context, And on the other hand, you have a tradition of stopping that early in the 20th century. Because directly after the Russian Revolution, books in Hebrew couldn't be published anymore. They could only publish books in Yiddish. And if a book is in Yiddish, it is related to marginalized, not that marginalized communities, but communities of a different kind. There are wonderful things in the Russian museum collections, including Yiddish theater from the 30s producing King Lear, and here you can also find boundary objects. A photo of Yiddish King Lear might be tagged very differently. Interestingly, the Metropolitan Museum of Arts doesn't mention Yiddish. Although plenty of artists from the collections were from Yiddish-speaking families and Yiddish communities. So this fact could be mentioned in textual descriptions or in references. These are just very different academic traditions, emphasizing very different things and contextualizing very different things.
Excellent. Indeed. And that also reflects very nicely with the example of the Armenian medieval monuments. And what is it? Is it medieval monuments, photographs of the 50s? Is something about the resilience of the architecture itself? So indeed, where are the priorities and how we are approaching the cataloging process is very important. Sometimes these priorities do make sense. Some other times are quite biased and hidden, as you very highly recognized and presented this very interesting report. So thank you very much for all that. I think we are coming now to the time. It's 2 o'clock. Unless we have any further questions or any further comments that people would like to make, we have reached to the end of this very interesting event. Thank you again. Thank you, Kora. Thank you, Ina, for joining us, for bringing all this interesting presentation and knowledge to the Sloane Lab. We will carry on with the series. Please, watch this space as we develop these conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andreas and Alexandra and Kiara and Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you. It was such an interesting conversation and a meeting and the whole symposium series. Thanks a lot.